Hi, this is Stan. Welcome back to the Crow's Nest Railroad. Well, we're not exactly at the Crow's Nest Railroad. We hit the road, so stay tuned. Well, I'm over at my friend Bob's machine shop here. Bob is a great friend. He's a member of Maricopa Live Steamers. And Bob, how many steam locomotives have you worked on in the last 3 years?
Well, I've built two myself, and this third one I'm working on now is for Maricopa Live Steamers for the sale by the club to a member.
But Tim's locomotive, my locomotive.
There you go. So now we're up to four.
I mean,
the number keeps growing.
Okay, so let's take a look at this Chloe project that Bob's involved in trying to bring back to life.
What we've got is a Stephenson valve gear on this locomotive. There are two common valve gears in the hobby at the moment, Walschertz and Stephenson. Stevenson's gear is entirely within the frame, and that's the mechanism that you see in this portion here. And as you can see, it gets quite complex, and it's very hard to service. So the boiler's been removed from the locomotive because I am attempting to complete the locomotive for sale by the club. And the previous owner was unable to finish it, and he could not get it to run on steam, so I had to rebuild D valves, which is this bronze aspect right here in the center of this box.
We'll get some tight shots on these too, so
Certainly.
folks can see that.
And then the rest of the mechanism. It consists of eccentrics, four eccentrics.
Okay, let me zoom in on that. Okay, go for it.
So there's four eccentrics, two eccentrics for each side of the locomotive. You've got a forward and a reverse eccentric on one side and a forward and a reverse eccentric on the other side. In this instance, we've got more than just this element in play. We have a pair of curved guides and a block that follows in that called a link block. And these links, as they're called, have a slot in them. And that slot engages the link block, which is tied to this rocker arm, which moves the valve stem. So as the locomotive rotates in motion, all these eccentrics, all four of them, are operating in unison, controlling the link blocks, which then control the rocker arm, which then controls the valve stem to the D-slide valve, which is the heart of the whole issue at this point.
Well, I'm going to interrupt the flow here to say that I'm back in my own shop right now at the workbench, and I thought that since many of you are like me and you're not all that familiar with steam engines but are way more familiar with like an automobile engine, I thought I would just explain a little bit as best as I can understand. I'm a newbie with steam engines, and so sometimes it helps me to think things out on paper. So let's take a look with paper and pencil. So your automobile engine, it's called an internal combustion engine, and that is because all of the heat energy is inside of the cylinder on top of the piston. So the gases are detonated or set on fire, and that explosion or massive expansion forces the piston down. And as a matter of fact, your automotive engine always spins in the same direction whether or not you want to go forward or backward with the car. The motor continues to spin, usually in a clockwise direction when you view it from the front. And if you want to go backwards with your car, then you need a transmission that you can fiddle with and change some positions of the gears and actually make the wheels go in the opposite direction. So you can go forward and you can go in reverse thanks to the tranny, but the engine continually rotates in the same direction, and that's called our internal combustion engine. Now a steam engine is completely different. You're all familiar with the large big tank that you might see on a steam engine. That's actually the boiler. You can think of that, got the smokestack coming out of the smoke box in the front. You can think of this as kind of like your gas tank in an automobile, and our fire is underneath the back of the boiler in here. And so this is an external combustion engine meaning all of our heat energy is transferred here on the outside of what is essentially the fuel tank. It would be absolute insanity to build a fire under the fuel tank of an automobile. But steam engine works a little differently. So we build our fire back here. There's water in here. It gets heated up and converted to steam. And this hot steam is sent into the cylinder. But unlike an automobile, the steam is alternately set behind the piston and in front of the piston, unlike your automobile where the expanding gases are only on one side of the piston. So imagine this is our big train wheel, our driver, and we want to go forward, and you can see here the rod is hooked up to the wheel, and in order to go forward, this wheel has to go in an anti-clockwise direction. So this rod has to push this way, which means our cylinder has to push this way, which means the steam has to be let in front of the piston. When the piston gets to the back position, we want to continue the motion, and then the steam reverses and is sent behind the piston to shove it forward, but that's when this bar is in this position. Okay, so right here we're shoving the piston toward the back of the cylinder, and this connecting rod here is rounding around like this with the wheel, and it's going to come up over here, and then we want the steam to push in the opposite direction. We typically have 2 cylinders on our steam engines, and so that's why you hear 4 chuffing sounds when the locomotive is moving, because it goes chuff, 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 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's because we're pushing on this piston, this narrow piston, front and back. Well, that's all well and good if we only want our locomotive to go forward, but we want to be able to stop the locomotive, not get trapped there and have someone get out and try and push the locomotive to a favorable spot. We want the locomotive to go backwards, which means when this rod is in this position, we want it to rotate the wheel this way. So let me draw that really quick. So now we want our locomotive to go backwards, which means this wheel has to turn clockwise, which means that when the rod is in this position, we need it to be pushing back. And so now we want our steam in the front side of the piston to drive it back. So we have to change how we're introducing steam into the cylinder based on where the connecting rod is on this big driver wheel. And that's where the valve gear comes in. The valve gear, when we move our lever forward or backwards on the reversing lever, that's what alternates when we start feeding the steam, and the timing of that is the D valve that we've been talking about on that Stephenson valve gear. You can see on my locomotive, for example, at home, all of the valve gears on the outside where you can see it really well. So let's look at my small steam locomotive. You can see the connecting rod here, which comes off the main cylinder here. This is at the bottom of the driver, and if we were going forward, that means that this rod here is going to want to drive in this direction. It's about halfway through its cycle, and once this driver gets around here out the back of this driving wheel, then the piston would be about at the end of its travel. So in this situation, when my reversing lever is shoved forward, it's going to be pouring steam ahead of the piston to drive the piston back. And you can see this little rocking mechanism here in the forward position. That's telling the valve up here to drive the steam in front of the piston. So now the locomotive has moved forward, and this connecting rod has come all the way around up to here, which means the piston is on its way forward, and we would be expecting steam now to be pouring in behind the piston to help push it forward, because my reversing lever is still in the forward position. and this is the little valve connecting rod. However, we'll say we were stopped at the station and I want to suddenly turn around and go backwards. Again, the whole engine has to turn in reverse. There's no transmission. So if I take my reversing lever, watch this. Rotate it back. You can see it's changed the valve position. And now it's going to be, instead of trying to shove steam behind the piston and continue the forward motion, this has changed the timing now such that it's going to be putting steam again in front of the piston and driving it backwards, so that as the steam locomotive moves back now, we've got steam ahead of the piston and it's pushing back. I hope that's a halfway decent explanation for you. Let's get back over to Bob's shop and take another look at that Chloe. And all of this is really compared to wherever the position of the piston is,
Exactly
right?
Because remember, the piston is tied to the piston rod to the crosshead to the main rod to the crank pin to the driver. So as this driver turns, the crank pin of the driver changes rotational position, pushing the main rod forward, which addresses the piston movement, and at the same time that movement is incorporated through the eccentrics on the inboard side of the operations to control the steam admission valve. So this valve is the timing element of the locomotive. This valve determines when the piston gets steam. So it, in conjunction to piston position, is what makes the locomotive operate. So as you see, the valve moves, and its position is there for changing all the time. As this block slides back and forth, we're changing positions on the ports that are milled into the top of that block. Now you can just see a hole here where one port is located. So there's a big,
lean in a little bit.
there's a big slot there. There's 3 slots, one that you see here, one in the middle, and one at the end. So the outboard slots are steam entry, and the inboard slot is steam exhaust on what is called an outside admission valve.
Well, I'm going to keep working. I got to pop this valve cover off again. We need to take another look at the D valve. There may be a problem with the shape or the sizes of the ports in the bottom of the D valve. We're going to have to take a good look at this. Anyway, I hope it's been interesting for you to kind of look on the inside of the valve operation of a steam engine. It's always fascinating for me, and I want to say thank you so much for making it this far in the video, and I hope to see you right here next time on the Crow's Nest Railroad.